All right. Good evening, everyone. Again, this evening we are going to pick up at the beginning of what Robertson categorizes as part 13. There are a total of 14 the way he divides out the gospel accounts. So we're up to Matthew 26, Mark 14, Luke 22, John 18 there. And this section that we're beginning tonight is the overall section of the arrest, trial, crucifixion, and burial of Christ. The last section will be the resurrection and the events after that. But this section, as we begin part 13 specifically, is the betrayal, the arresting, and the forsaken aspects of what Christ goes through. So this is the Garden of Gethsemane, and this follows up by way of review with the prayer. John 17 and then verse 18 is Christ agonized there at the end of the evening. We're somewhere probably towards the middle or beginning to move towards the morning of what we would call Wednesday morning, possibly as late as midnight or so. But this is Abib 14. And so we'll read the account of John. He has the most detail here in this section. So John 18, verse 2, it says, Judas, who betrayed him, Christ, also knew the place where Jesus often met there with the disciples. And the place there is the Garden of Gethsemane. And it seemed to be a location that Christ removed himself to with the disciples on a regular basis. Don't think of a garden in the typical sense. It's more like a grove, because Gethsemane was a grove of olive trees. This is across the Kidron Valley from the temple, so to the east of the temple. And this olive grove was there probably to facilitate the volume of oil that was necessary for the various things at the temple. But it would be an open area, and Christ would use that as an area or a place to further instruct the disciples. Judas knew this, and so he knew where Christ would be that evening. So remember, Judas had left after the foot washing. Christ had gone through the balance of the Passover symbols that he was instituting, the instruction, the prayer, and now we're up to this part. So Judas, verse 3, John 18, then having taken a detachment of soldiers and officers from the chief priests, the Pharisees, came there with lanterns, torches, and weapons. So we know here a detachment of soldiers means the Roman soldiers. And the word there indicates a cohort, which is, depending on the type of soldiers, between 600 or 1,000 men, roughly. So this is a lot of soldiers. What's interesting is the Jewish authorities brought their own. So it says the officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees. So think of that in terms of temple police. The Jews policing themselves if things got too out of hand. In the northwest corner of the temple complex was the Antonian fortress, the Roman fortress. This is where Christ would be scourged here in a little while. But they could quickly move Roman soldiers out to put down any violence on the Temple Mount. So there were a lot of people that showed up here, and they had so promoted the lie that Christ was a troublemaker and that he was going to foment rebellion, that they believed their own lie, and they brought just this gaggle of people, this huge number, to prevent what they thought Christ was going to do. So John 18, verse 4, it says, Jesus, therefore, knowing all things that were happening to him, went out and said to them, who are you looking for? So none of this was by surprise on Christ. I mean, he says in a number of places, we'll come to here in a moment again, where he said this was done all for prophecy. He knew he was the one who spoke these prophecies and had them recorded in what we call the Old Testament. And he was not surprised in the least, but nonetheless, he sort of engages them. He wasn't cowering here. He wasn't pulling back. He wasn't trying to slip under the radar and accomplish this by the least possible means. He was confronting them head on. So verse 5, they answered him and said, Jesus of Nazareth. Now what's interesting is many times as he had been around, he must have been very ordinary. And unfortunately, in all the paintings, even in some of the illustrations I've included in this harmony, Christ stands out. He's got the cleanest clothes. He's got the best looking clothes. He's got the long hair. He's got the very fine European white man features. He probably looked nothing like that. He blended into the crowds on a regular basis. He just looked like an average Jew, probably average height, which wasn't probably very tall, probably somewhere between 5'8" and 5'10". Most historians believe the men of that age were. And so he says, I'm he, I am. What's interesting here in this section is that the word he in the next couple of verses is not there in the Greek. And so to read it properly, Jesus answered them saying, I am. Now, this is part of why they would later switch the charge from treason to blasphemy, because that name, of course, was the name that God gave Moses at the burning bush, the Yahweh, Jehovah. And this was claiming to be God, which he was. Going back to John 1:1, we know that he was. But this, to their ears, is blasphemy. So what he's also saying here is that I am the one who Israel knew. And so there's a lot wrapped into just that simple statement, I am. He mentions this previously back in John 8. He uses the I am name there as well. And John records that more than any of the other writers. And so this takes them back. So then continuing here, it says, Judas also, who betrayed him, was standing with them. So Judas is the one who's going to identify him. Now it's not just that Christ was ordinary looking. Going back to verse 2, it states there that there's this large group that was here. All the Roman soldiers, all the temple officers, the chief priests, the Pharisees. You had this large group, this crowd. Not everyone would have known him and or recognized him. So Judas here still hasn't officially betrayed him yet. He's brought all these people, but he's not identified them to seal the deal. So then verse 6 of John 18. When he had therefore said this to them, I am, they went backward and fell to the ground, which is an interesting response. They pulled back. If he indeed was God, is God, they pulled back instead of kneeling and worshiping, moving toward him, which almost all the prophets did. Pulling back is what Satan does. As I have in my note there, those submissive to God move forward. We have Mary embracing Christ. We have Mary Magdalene at the Passover, right before the Passover, day or so before the Passover, anointing his feet and holding him, and all these people that wanted to draw near him. And so it's just very interesting. They all fell to the ground backward, overwhelmed with this. It's not the reaction I would think they would have, but anyway. So then again, verse 7, it says, again, therefore, they asked him. They're not convinced at this point. They want to, I guess they're shocked a bit. They're stunned a bit. Maybe they're thinking, well, did I hear him right? And so they asked him again, and he answers, I am. They said, Jesus of Nazareth. Who are you looking for? He asked. Jesus of Nazareth. So then he answers and said, verse 8, I told you that I am. If therefore you seek me, let these go their way. The rest of the disciples, if it's me you're after, these men are innocent, let them leave. And he said this that the word might be spoken, fulfilled which he spoke, of those whom you gave me, I have lost none. Another prophecy he's quoting. So this was not to be a battle here. Now, Christ had told them to go buy swords, and they said they had two, and he said that's sufficient. So why did he have them buy swords if they were not going to use them? We'll see here that Peter does try to use it. Part of it was so that the accusation that they were creating a rebellion, that they were ne'er-do-wells and they were fomenting trouble, all of that would be justified. He told them to buy swords. He didn't tell them to use them. So the battle that we have is not a physical battle. We don't wrestle against flesh and blood, as Paul writes, but rather it's a spiritual battle. They'll see this later on. All of the disciples will face martyrdom as we know the history, except for John. So then to move to Mark's account, Mark 14, verse 44, says, now he who betrayed him had given them a sign, saying, whoever I kiss, that is he, seize him and lead him away safely. Now, there are some who wonder if Judas did not understand or anticipate that they did not intend to just take Christ away, that they were going to kill him. Some have wondered that he probably didn't realize that. That might have contributed to his suicide later. But nonetheless, what he says here is to lead him away, and notice, safely is Mark's account. So then, verse 45, when he had come, immediately he came to him. When Judas had come, he immediately came to Christ and said, Rabbi, Rabbi, and kissed him. So we have other prophecies, such as Psalm 41, verse 9, where it says, even my own familiar friend in whom I've trusted, who ate my bread, has lifted up his heel against me. So the question, and I did not send these out, so I apologize for that, but a question here is, what was especially hurtful in this kiss? If you can imagine this taking place, Christ is standing there. I picture all the disciples sort of around him. Peter, probably with his hand on the hilt of the sword, all of them confused, looking at this crowd, realizing they're immensely outnumbered, and they're listening to Christ with this interaction of the leaders here. And now Judas comes up and says this. And I suspect that in spite of knowing that Judas would betray him, because remember at the Passover meal, he said to Judas, go and do what you're going to do quickly. So within a matter of a couple of hours, he had gone and made his deal with the Jewish leadership. They had gathered their soldiers. They had gone to the Romans, and they had convinced them this man was going to try to stir up a rebellion in the middle of the night. So all this took place. And I suspect in spite of all that, Christ was probably very disappointed and hurt. Because in spite of Judas doing what he did, this is somebody that lived and walked with Christ for 3.5 years, listened to his instruction, was part of witnessing the miracles and all that was done in that time. And you or I might sort of hate him for what he did and feel that deep trait of betrayal. But I suspect Christ here felt a lot of sadness. Did he know where Judas would take this? Not, I don't think so, but maybe he anticipated, probably. But nonetheless, it doesn't bode well for Judas. That's the big question mark we'll come to as we progress here in the next couple of weeks. Is Judas lost forever? He's certainly lost out on the first resurrection. Is he going to be part of the second? Or is he of those few, as we read in Revelation, because they've known what God is offering, they have willingly, knowingly rejected it, and there's no room for repentance? I don't know. I suspect he's going to be in the second. This is my opinion for what it's worth, because he did not have God's Spirit. He was not being judged for salvation at that point, even though he had knowledge. But God's merciful, and we'll see how that all works out. But nonetheless, this is what he does. He kisses him, identifies him very directly. So, verse 46 of Mark 14, they laid their hands on him and seized him. That was the cue. So the soldiers, the officers of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, probably the Sanhedrin, probably moved very quickly in to grab Christ and to seize him here. So verse 47, but a certain one of those who stood by, and who is the certain one of them? We know from John's account in John 18, verse 10, that it's Peter, Simon Peter. Therefore, having a sword, drew it and struck the priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. So, in order to cut off an ear, Peter is probably not swinging down. He's probably swinging horizontally. He was going for the head, it seems. Malchus ducked, but not quick enough, and the sword took off his ear. Pretty traumatizing. But let's back up and finish the thought here. So, in Luke's account, we have the question. So in Luke 22 and verse 49, it says, those who were around him saw what was about to happen. That is what Mark records, that they were going to lay their hands on him and seize him. So the disciples see this, the movement in the crowd, they can anticipate what's about to happen. And so they ask Christ, before it does, shall we strike with the sword? And it seems that Peter didn't wait for the answer. And so then following in Matthew's account, Matthew 26, verse 52, we have here Christ then saying to Peter specifically, but probably also others that may have had swords, put your sword back into its place, for all those who take the sword will die by the swords. So as I mentioned, the swords were only to give justification to the Jewish and Roman authorities that he was a criminal. It was not to fight against them. What's interesting in Luke's account is that we have the response of Christ in spite of the crowd there to seize him, and he knows what's going to transpire from here. It's all of these events are leading up to his crucifixion, his death, and in spite of that, he still has this desire to serve and help people, because Peter cut off the ear of Malchus. In Luke 22, verse 51, Jesus then says, let me at least do this. And he touched his ear and healed him. Now, again, we don't know how many people are there, 600 or so Roman soldiers. Who knows how many officers of the court, the Sanhedrin, who knows how many of their temple police, if you will, were there as well, and perhaps a crowd that sort of tagged along, because when you see a group that large moving through the town very quickly, you know something's going to take place, and everybody likes to see a good train wreck. So there was probably a large crowd there, maybe 800 or more people. And this is another miracle that these people witness. And especially for Malchus, I mean, there are a lot of blood vessels in the ear, not major arteries, just blood vessels. You cut an ear off and it's going to bleed pretty significantly. There's going to be a lot of blood, and it's going to look a lot worse than it is, actually. It's not a mortal wound, but nonetheless, you know, I sort of picture Christ picking up this ear, wherever it is, putting it to the side of Malchus, and when he removes his hand, it's restored. You would think that would motivate Malchus, but we never hear his name again. Maybe he was too invested in the narrative from the Sanhedrin, from the high priest, maybe his own anger and whatever, but it doesn't seem to have made a difference. I would hope that it would, but another question to ask, did Malchus respond because of that? So going back to Matthew's account, Matthew 26 and verse 53, he says, do you not think that I could ask my Father, even now he would send me more than 12 legions of angels? So a legion in the Roman use was around 5,600 soldiers, and they would be divided into different units. But Christ here is saying, not just 5,600. Christ could send me 12 of those, or the Father could send me 12 of those legions if I asked for it. But he's not going to ask for it. That's not the point. He's not here again to fight. That's his next coming. This was to be a lamb, a Passover sacrifice for us. So he says, how then would the scripture be fulfilled that it must be so? If I asked for this intervention, and if God the Father did it, then how would the prophecies be fulfilled? So continue in Matthew 26:50, verse 55. He said, in that hour, Jesus said to the multitudes, and remember, there's a great crowd here with all of these soldiers and leadership of the Jews and so forth. He says to them all, have you come out against us as a robber with swords and clubs to seize me? Why? Seriously? You're coming out here as if I've got all these weapons, all this mob. I'm ready to just overtake the country and throw off the Romans. He says, I sat daily in the temple teaching, and you didn't arrest me. You know who I am. You've seen me. You've heard me. You've watched me for over 3.5 years. But he says in verse 56, all this has happened that the scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled. And then the disciples left him and fled. It says all the disciples. Now, in the next section, when Christ is taken to the high priest's home, we know that 2 of them at least are there. Peter and perhaps one other, and we'll talk about that as we get to it. But at this point, remember earlier, he said to them, if you've come to seek me, let these others go. And it seems that they did. But there was still some other things that took place. In Mark's account, Mark 14, verse 50, we have the same thought summarized. They all left him and fled. This matter of fleeing is not sort of this organized, casual retreat. It's as if they're scooting out as fast as they can before anybody changes their mind. In verse 51, then, the question here is, who is this young man? A certain young man followed him, followed Christ, having a linen cloth thrown around himself over his naked body. So this is someone who came, and perhaps, as I said earlier, they saw the soldiers, they saw the crowds, they saw the high priest and his entourage with him, and they followed to see what was going on. And so in the middle of the night, just hastily throws on a robe and goes to the event. In this case, it says, having thrown a linen cloth around himself, otherwise being naked. The young man, grabbed him. For whatever reason, this young man caught their attention. They went to grab him, but all they got was the cloak. Verse 52, he left the linen cloth and fled from them naked. Tradition and theologians, many of them say this certain young man was Mark. Now, Mark's writing this account, and he uses a phrasing that John oftentimes uses as well. And John speaks of himself oftentimes in the third person. Certain disciple, or the disciple whom Christ loved. John never names himself directly, while most everybody knows that he's talking about himself. And in this case, Mark does a similar thing. A certain young man sort of identifies himself, perhaps without naming himself, and telling on himself without making it look prideful. Very honest here. He ran away naked. That would be very embarrassing. John Mark later comes into the scene in Acts with Paul and Barnabas, becomes a point of contention. It seems that he was a very young man, even when he later became connected with Paul and Barnabas. Perhaps not as mature as Paul wanted to see, maybe didn't have the same drive at that time that Paul wanted to see. Became a point of division between Paul and Barnabas, and rather than let it grow, they separated. Paul went with Silas, and Barnabas took John Mark, and evidently did a very good job mentoring him, because later, when Paul's in prison, he asks for Mark to come. So Acts 15 there, 2 Timothy 4, if you want to read those. So then going back to John's account, John 18 and verse 12, it says, so the detachment, the commanding officer, and the officers of the Jews seized Jesus and bound him. So even though the Jewish authorities made a big deal of this to bring out all the Roman soldiers, it seems at this point then the Roman soldiers leave. They're not involved with this. Maybe they determined this was an internal matter. Maybe they were there just to make sure that the Jewish authorities could arrest Christ, to have their trial. At this point, they're not involved because this is all of the officers of the Jews. They seize him and they bound him, tied his hands together in some fashion, probably. So then we move to the next section, which is now the examination by Annas, the former high priest. This is the father, the patriarch, if you will, of the family. And by way of reminder, a couple of things here. The high priest position, as God defined it, was to be a lifetime appointment. That is, Aaron was the high priest until he died, and then his oldest male heir became the high priest until he died, and so forth down through time. By the time the Romans came on the scene, in order to sort of control the Jews more, they made the high priest office more of a political appointee. Now, they kept it within the high priest family, but it seems that it was only for a year or two or a very limited time. It was not a lifetime appointment any longer. But Annas still had great clout, if you will, in the city as the high priest, the patriarch probably of the family at that time. And so he's still the go-to guy. He's the power behind the throne, if you will. So he moved to John's account, and as another reminder, John's focus in his gospel account is to show the divinity of Christ. So we're going to get a lot more detail in John's accounts here as we move forward than any of the other writers. They're going to cover things, but John's going to cover it in more detail. So John 18 and verse 13, we pick up this story here. So then the commanding officer, going back to the previous verse, commanding officers, officers of Jews, they had seized Christ and bound him. Verse 13, they led him to Annas first, for he was father-in-law to Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. So Annas's daughter had married Caiaphas. And Caiaphas was the high priest that year. Verse 14, now it was Caiaphas who advised the Jews that it was expedient for one man, that one man should perish for the people. This was a prophecy, wasn't it? Without knowing it, he said it would be more expedient for one man to die for the people than for the whole nation. Now, he meant that literally, but it became a prophecy, didn't it? Because Christ did die for the people in their place. But this family was not liked by the average Jews because they made merchandise of God's people. This is why Christ was so upset when he went on to the Temple Mount and they had all the booths set up to exchange money. They had the booths set up to buy the animals. And it wasn't just that it was a matter of convenience, that you had to travel all the way from Italy and you're there to sacrifice a lamb. And it was really almost impossible to bring that lamb with you and you need to buy one. It wasn't just that. Even if you brought your own animal, the priests would find something wrong with it. This is an animal that can't be sacrificed. You have to go to the booth over there and buy an acceptable animal. And so they made merchandise of the people. They ruled the city, especially the nation as a whole, but especially Jerusalem, and made themselves wealthy off the people. So verse 19 here, the high priest therefore asked Jesus about his disciples and about his teaching. Now, as this night progresses into the next morning, then, when they turn him over to the Roman authorities to eventually crucify him, there are a number of things that are illegal according to Jewish law that begin to take place here. And this is one of them. The high priest when an individual, if an individual was brought before the high priest, and the high priest would be the president, if you will, of the Sanhedrin. And the Sanhedrin was made up of other priests. It was also made up of what was called some of the scribes, which were of the priestly family, and they were this Supreme Court, to use an expression, not an expression, but a identifier that we would understand. So if you were brought before the high priest, much like we have the Fifth Amendment to not incriminate ourselves, the high priest was not supposed to interrogate the person, but here he is. He's interrogating Christ. So verse 20, Christ nonetheless answers him. He says, I spoke openly to the world. I always taught in synagogues and in the temple where the Jews always meet. I said nothing in secret. That was part of the charge here, right? Treason. That he is secretly gathering this crowd, this mob, the following to overthrow the Romans. That would be problematic because it would put everything in jeopardy, and the Romans certainly had a reputation of not being easy on rebellion. And so Christ here is answering, well, you're asking about me. Why are you asking about me? I didn't do anything in secret. You heard me teach in the synagogues. You heard me teach in the temple. You heard me teach wherever the Jews were. There was nothing that I did that was secret. It's verse 21. So why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said to them. And behold, these know the things which I said. And I sort of see him gesturing at this point. You know, this crowd that followed him to Annas' house. So before Annas was to ask any questions, if he was going to ask any, there was a whole process, what we would call due process, where there would be witnesses sought, to use our terms, for the prosecution. Witnesses would be called for the defense. This is the middle of the night, isn't it? And in most cases, that would take days because it would take time for people to get to wherever the trial was being held. But they're accelerating all of this because they don't really want to follow process here. They're looking for an excuse. So nonetheless, he says, you can ask other people, verse 22, and when he had said this, one of the officers standing by slapped Jesus with his hand and saying, do you answer the high priest like that? Now, this was another aspect of things that were illegal, and that is any kind of punishment before there was any sentencing. But even here, what was disrespectful about this? So we have the example later in Acts where Paul was before the Sanhedrin and he made a comment about the high priest, and the high priest was there, and they called him on it, and he apologized. But what was said here that would have warranted this response by the officer? But and nonetheless, he slapped him, and I'm sure it wasn't a soft slap. This was something probably with some momentum and power behind it. Jesus, nonetheless, probably, as he recovered, looked at this officer and said, if I have spoken wrongly, testify of the wrong. Tell me what I've done. Put it out there. But if I answer truthfully, why do you beat me? But again, there are prophecies here that begin to come into play. In Isaiah 45, I'll turn there. You don't have your Bible handy, but I'll read it for you. Isaiah 45 and verse 19 says here, I have not spoken in secret in a dark place of the earth. I did not say to the seed of Egypt, seek me in vain. So this goes back to his statement that I've not done anything in secret. Going back a chapter, forward in Isaiah to chapter 48 and in verse 16 says, come near to me and hear this. I have not spoken in secret from the beginning. From the time that it was, I was there. So even though Paul talks about the gospel message being a mystery, it's a mystery because they don't understand it. It's not a mystery because it's not in front of them, but because they don't understand it. And so he's being beaten here for not, I guess, making it clear enough to them not liking his response. Again, any justification for punishment. Sort of this group is highly agitated, and they're looking for payback, if you will. The high priest had convinced, I'm sure, all those that followed him out to the garden, that this man was the source of problems. And this is oftentimes the case when individuals are looking for justification to do something. Other people become a problem or the cause of their problems. And so there are a number of things that happen here, and it's interesting how this plays out. In the little box there on the corner, this is the order of the trial, that he's examined here before Annas, and then later, specifically, he's tried before Caiaphas, and we'll come to that in just a little bit in the next section. And then after that trial, he's tried before the Sanhedrin. So they've actually got things out of order. This is another aspect of the illegality of all of this. He was supposed to go to the Sanhedrin first, and then the trial would move from there. Nonetheless, so he goes before the Jewish authorities first, and then after he's before the Sanhedrin, he goes before the Roman authorities. And he first goes to Pilate. Pilate initially doesn't want anything to do with it. He kicks it up to Herod Antipas. He goes and examines before Herod. Herod's curious if he doesn't get the response from Christ that he was looking for, so he kicks it back down to Pilate. And so Christ comes before Pilate again, and this is where Pilate offers to release the prisoner, Barabbas or Christ, and they demand that Barabbas is released and crucify Christ, is the chant that goes up from the mob. So we move now from the high priest's house to before the Sanhedrin. So we're moving through the night. This is probably shortly before dawn, Abib 14 again. And to continue in Matthew's account now, Matthew 26, verse 57 says, those who had taken Jesus led him away to Caiaphas, the high priest. So he was at Annas' house. He goes now to the son-in-law's home, the current high priest, Caiaphas, says, where the scribes and the elders were gathered together. So this is the Sanhedrin. What's interesting is they're not at the temple where the Sanhedrin normally meets. They're at Caiaphas's house. And so it says, verse 59, the chief priests and the elders and the whole council sought false testimony against Christ that may put him to death. So it seems that they solicited witnesses specifically who would condemn Christ, not necessarily specifically what they would condemn him of. But they needed charges. And in the Old Testament, Christ said, if 2 or 3 witnesses, a matter will be established. So they need several of these people to come with the same story so they can convict Christ. And they want a capital crime. Notice the end of verse 59, that they might put him to death. But verse 60, they didn't find anyone. They didn't get what they were looking for. The witnesses weren't delivering, if you will. So it says, even though many false witnesses came forward, they found none, meaning none who would probably have a capital crime. But it says they at last found 2 false witnesses to come forward. So again, before we leave this area, move forward here, just to highlight again that there should have been no formal business done at the house of Caiaphas, even though other members of the Sanhedrin were there. This was beyond improper. The other thing is that they're commencing a trial here during the middle of the night. So at no point in this are they asking Christ if he has witnesses to the contrary. They're not searching diligently for that. And so you also have the matter of false witnesses, going back to Deuteronomy 19, what the consequence was. And under Jewish law, if a witness was later shown and proved to have delivered false testimony, then he was punished as well. So these two false witnesses come forward in verse 61. They said, this man said, I'm able to destroy the temple of God and build it in 3 days. So they got two to at least agree, but this is not a capital crime, but at least it's something. In Mark's account there, Mark 14, verse 58, they say that they heard Christ say, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another made without hands. And that's not really a false testimony, is it? In light of what Christ said and taught over the years, of course, they're taking it the wrong way here. But they're not being honest with what they're saying that Christ said. Because in verse 59 of Mark 14, it says their testimony didn't agree. And so this is another aspect, as I mentioned a moment ago. There's supposed to be at least 2 or 3 witnesses to agree, but even these false witnesses couldn't agree. They were all over the map, if you will. So continuing in Mark, verse 60, it says the high priest stood up in the middle, that is the middle of the group, and asked Jesus, have you no answer? What is it which these testify against you? So he's asking Christ again to defend himself, which is not the responsibility of the accused. The prosecution, if you will, is supposed to make the case. Witnesses can testify for or against, but Christ didn't have to respond here, but he did eventually. Verse 60, he stayed quiet and he answered nothing. And so this even comes to Isaiah 53, verse 7. Let me read that to you as well. Isaiah 53, verse 7, he was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He was led as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before his shearers is silent. So he opened not his mouth. Part of it, I'm sure, was to fulfill prophecies such as this in Isaiah, but part of it also is, what's the point? No matter what he says, they're going to twist it. They're going to take it out of context. They've already determined the outcome. It's just the details. So he's not participating, if you will. And so the high priest asked him again, the second time, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? Christ is going to respond to this. Notice again, I am, and you can take that both ways. In this case, he's probably taking it, just saying as a statement of fact, I am him. But, even going back to the title that we touched on previously, he says, I am, you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of the sky. Now, we know this refers to his second coming. But what Christ here is saying is, in due time, you'll understand that I am. I am the Christ. I am the Son of the Blessed. Well, they didn't hear any of that. As soon as Christ said this, verse 63, it says the high priest tore his clothes. Now, the high priests were to never do this. I want you to read that in Leviticus 21 there. Leviticus 21 and verse 9. They were never to rise to this level of emotional response. Leviticus 21 verse 9 says the daughter of any priest, I'm sorry, it's verse 10 that I want, not verse 9 there. Leviticus 21 verse 10, he who is the high priest among his brethren, on whose head the anointing oil was poured, and who is consecrated to wear the garments, the priestly garments, the linen garments, shall not uncover his head nor tear his clothes. Leviticus here goes on to mention other things the high priest isn't to do, but in the context of what we're reading here in Mark 14, he should have never done this. And in some ways, it shows how far the high priest had drifted in their understanding of their responsibility, the requirements they had to sort of represent God before the people, but also to teach them when he couldn't even follow the own instruction given to the high priest in Leviticus 21. So he tears his clothes because in his mind, what Christ said in verse 62 there of Mark 14 was blasphemy. This was just beyond the pale. This was just so outrageous. And to tear the clothes was a sign of deep grief and of being troubled emotionally. And so he does it. And then he makes the statement, what further need have we of witnesses? He says, we're done. Christ, just what he said right now. We don't need any other witnesses. You have heard the blasphemy, verse 64. And so then he's saying to the other men there from the Sanhedrin, what do you think? They all condemned him to be worthy of death. And in this is another aspect of the illegality of what they've done, because what they've now just done is they've changed the charges from treason to blasphemy. So we know the whole Sanhedrin wasn't here, because later Gamaliel comes up in Acts, and we know that he was not there. We have to wonder then how many others were not there. There's supposed to be 70. Were they all at Caiaphas's house? Probably not. They probably picked those who would be favorable to giving Caiaphas the judgment that he expected to hear. They were probably of the same mind. They probably didn't have to be convinced very hard. They were all upset with Christ and didn't want this to continue because of where they feared it might go in terms of the Romans. So then to continue on in Mark 14, verse 65, and we'll probably conclude it here for today. It says, some began to spit on him, and this is the abuse of the accused, and to cover his face, meaning like a shroud put over his face, a piece of cloth, so they couldn't see him. And it says to beat him with fists. And again, this is not proper according to Jewish laws, but as they're doing this, then they ask, or tell him rather, prophesy. It says the officers struck him with the palms of his hand, with their hands. The word prophesy there means divine foretelling. So they covered his face so he can't see. They're hitting him with open hands very violently, and in a very disrespectful, condescending way, essentially say, if you are the Messiah, you should be able to tell me who is striking you. You should be able to foresee this. So this is just the beginning of the abuse that he'll go through for the evening. In Luke's account, Luke 22, verse 65, it says, they spoke many other things against him, insulting him. It was not uncommon for him to be called out as an illegitimate child, and I'm sure there were other things that they disparaged him about, but the insulting nature here, there's just even no respect in terms of being merciful, even though someone might be wrong in an action. They're out for their pound of flesh. So this is at Caiaphas's residence, and what happens next is Peter's denial. And if you remember from the Passover ceremony, Passover meal, and the symbols that Christ instituted, he told Peter that he would deny Christ 3 times before the rooster crowed in the morning. And so next time we're going to see that play out. It's a very sort of sad account, but it's a reminder that we need to be close to Christ. We can oftentimes think we're stronger than we are. Peter's heart was there, but his mind wasn't. And when he was backed into a corner, he didn't want to have any connection to Christ initially. So we'll pick that up there next time.